Okay, welcome everybody to the June 27th edition of the Scientific Governance and Risk meeting at MakerDAO. My name is Richard Brown. I'm the head of community development. I have a few things that I'd like to say at the top of each call, and I'm going to continue to say them. I posted a link in the group chat. It's a link to our discussion thread. So every week we have these calls. These calls last for an hour and a half. We talk about a lot of really interesting things. Too many interesting things to actually dig into each one of them. So we continue these discussions in our subreddit, and we also post summaries of the calls there for people who weren't able to attend, which are wonderfully detailed and recently have included pictures as well. So if you want to get caught up, if you want people to get caught up with the things that you said and asked, follow that thread because we post summaries and the conversation continues. In these calls particularly, though, we have tons and tons and tons to go over, but we're also extremely interested in hearing from the community and the voters. So if you have a question that you want to have answered, please type it in the chat at the side. If you have access to a microphone, please just jump in and ask questions whenever they occur to you. We're pretty good about handling interruptions. If it turns out that we're in the middle of a flow, though, we'll circle back afterwards, but we love the back and forth, so please speak up if you have something to say. Traditionally in these calls, I spend the first, what I usually claim to be 5 minutes talking about governance. It rarely ends up being that efficient. Happily today, though, everybody's spared that because I've been racking my brains to think about what I can talk about, and I probably shouldn't be looking for reasons to waste time in these calls. So here's the short answer. Governance, it seems to be working the way it's supposed to, which is cool. For the last 3 or 4 weeks, the voters have signaled for no change. The stability fee seems to be doing what it's supposed to do. We have a longer tail conversation about whether the cadence is correct, whether the stepping is correct, whether we should, there's 10 or 15 various tweaks that we can talk about for governance. Those conversations about how we could change governance lasted for a while, and is probably going to be superseded by an improvement in the governance portal, which will make some of these debates moot. So I'm not going to dig back into those today. I'm going to hand it off almost immediately to Cyrus Younessi, and we can start talking about some risk. Cyrus, it's all yours.
Sure. Same schedule today. I think we'll start off with the monetary policy stuff from Vishesh, and then we'll jump into the next phase of collateral risk. Pretty simple. Vishesh, you on the call?
Yep. Okay. All right, we see everything all right. So all in all, it's been a pretty interesting week, I think. Just to touch on the state of the peg real quick, it's been fairly steady. There's been kind of a slight drift and a slight increase in variance over the past month or so, but nothing to be worried about. And I think this was part of the discussion around that spread is easier to widen when the stability fee is lower because there's a little bit less pressure. And I think that's something we can double click on later. But more importantly is in the past 24 hours or so, there's been a huge spike in trading volume, and DAI price has actually done pretty all right in the face of that. It seems that there was some profit booking from ETH rising, which is really interesting because actually this, the time cutoff, there's a little bit of a time delay on this graph. The time cutoff was at around 14 million. Since then, the trading volume has come up to about 16, almost 17 million. And DAI price is actually slightly higher than this now. So I'll just show that real quick. So there's been a lot of trading activity, a lot of, I think, good trading activity for DAI. I think a fair amount of selling ETH for DAI. There was some back and forth in the sense that in the past few hours with the drop in ETH price, we had some liquidations, fairly decent size. And so, when those liquidations happen, you have some of that sale of collateral as well. So what's interesting is there's been some transaction activity in both directions is what I'm getting at, but DAI price has been fairly strong throughout that. So I think we're going to continue to see this. DAI is not as much of a glass jaw as it had been in the past. And so even in the large selling periods, the DAI price doesn't shoot up quite as dramatically as it had in the past. And then in those selling periods, it also doesn't seem to crater as much as it had in the past. So both good indicators for the stability of DAI, I think. Just the tremendous fluidity and depth of the spread that you've seen in trading activity over the past 24 hours is, I think, indicative of the large amount of trading volume, in the sense that when you have those huge spikes in trading volume, there's some slippage on protocols like Uniswap. There's a lot more depth to the order book, so the price moves in more granular increments, and so I think you tend to see this this graph kind of fill out a little bit. So that's been pretty interesting to watch. You can see there's at least in the past 24 hours a larger section that's been trading above $1 than below $1. But I think that's just because given all the pressures, there was more ETH selling than any ETH for DAI selling than anything else. So that helps to push it up, but it'll level out, I'm guessing. So yeah, I mean, I think this graph, there's not much to say. The ETH price has been consistently rising. There was that sudden drop just kind of overnight, and I think what we'll see is, with that sudden drop, again, those liquidations, a little bit of a boon for DAI price, but not much change overall. What's interesting is, generally, when there's that profit booking happening, you'll see kind of a commensurate decrease in DAI supply, or at least a commensurate rise in collateralization ratio, because people get scared of those liquidations and they punch in a little bit more collateral. But also the price went down, so in nominal terms, all the collateral decreased in value as well. So those kind of balance out, where in the extremely short term, you would see a bit of a drop in collateralization, and then you will see it rise up as kind of a counter effect. So as far as the supply, it's been rising, somewhat consistently since 17.5% and 16.5%. It's up to 86.4 on here, but in reality, it's up to about 87 million right now. So what's really interesting about that is there were a ton of transactions, both on the minting and burning side, as well as the liquidations that were going on. So just a ton of activity in general in the past 24 hours. So, you saw, and actually in the past week, there's been a fair amount of activity in general. So about 5 days ago, there was, 2.5 million that was burned and 2 million that was minted. Then the next day there was, 1 million that was minted and, relatively little burned. And then in the past 24 hours, about 3 million plus minted, and then about 2 million wiped. So, even though net the supply has not changed dramatically quickly, it is a consistent increase. There's been a ton of usage. Yeah.
I have a quick question as to something that I think would be an interesting indicator. So whenever I see like large wipes, I always go on DAIstats.com and check out the burner. And I know that if the burner didn't increase by a lot of MKR, that like huge amount of wiped debt is like very short term. Do you think that that's something that's like useful in any way?
Yes, and maybe I can give you a preview of something interesting right at the end here. So in terms of the fees that are accrued, and I think that'll help illuminate sort of that question around accrued fees versus short-term debt getting paid back. but actually we'll touch on that just now. So the age of the debt that is getting paid back, that has been consistently cratering since, just after the 19.5% increase. What we saw was the age of open debt was consistently decreasing. So a lot of new debt being created and a fair amount of old debt being paid back. That had slowed as of the 16.5% increase, but with the past few days, what's been going on with ETH price, there's been a lot. There hasn't been that much more old debt being paid back, but there has been a fair amount of new debt being created. So, that does kind of actually touch on your question, David, which is it has been a fair amount of new debt getting paid back. But we can actually look at the fees a little bit later on as well.
Vishesh, can you go back to that graph and maybe explain the formulas behind these? So open die days is across all open CDPs, or sorry, across all die, what is the average amount of days that die has existed?
Yeah, so open die days is on average, so denominator is the amount of open debt, and denominator for closed die days is the total amount of closed debt, which includes both debt repaid and debt liquidated. And then the numerator is just the total number of days that the debt that is currently open has been open, and then for the closed, it was by the time it was paid back or liquidated, how many days had that debt been outstanding?
Interesting. So yeah, so as I understand it, then closed die days going up means that older debt is being paid back, or that the debt is closing is older than the average closed debt up to that point.
Yeah. So if I zoom out here, actually, what you'll see is there had in the past been a more dramatic increase in both. Right. So as the die supply was growing, there was sort of a consistent amount there, and it actually seems to be a trend where there's kind of this steady state of how old debt gets before it starts to get paid back, is how I would interpret it. So that kind of has consistently persisted, and it had slowed down recently, except in the past 3 weeks, I would say there was a bit of an uptick.
Yeah,
now,
what's interesting is it only goes up basically, which makes sense because it's in the earlier days, it's a new system. And so all the debt that's being paid back is pretty new, while presumably this doesn't go up forever, right? We haven't seen periods except for like really tiny ones where the thing has gone down.
Right. So I would not expect the closed debt age to decrease for quite a while, and it actually theoretically it could, and I have to double check on this, but I think it could continue to increase without ever needing to decrease, in the sense that if the die supply continues to grow, the average age could just kind of level out for debt getting paid back. It doesn't necessarily have to decrease. That would be kind of like if it hits this like equilibrium steady state. But
yeah, what's amazing about this is to me how closely it coincides with the higher stability fee regime. Like right as we hit that 19.5, it starts plummeting, and that, as I'm interpreting that just die is circulating in and out, circulating out at a much faster rate.
Yeah, well, there's a couple of reasons for that. One, yes, higher stability fee really, I think, lit a fire under a lot of people and prompted a lot of repayments, some refinancing, but I think a fair amount of repayment of old debt, which is what you really want to see out of the system. If you saw this open die days just continually rising, that's in some sense an accrual of risk, or at the very least kind of a delaying of revenues for Maker holders, which is not good. What's
Well, we can't ignore
interesting,
the drastically increasing ETH price in this as well. Like the timing of the 19.5 stability fee it's correlated to the bullishness of CDP holders. And so to me, what I saw in the increasing stability fee was one of the first leading indicators of a bull market or rising ETH price, as the stability fee is like a proxy for the sentiment of the people. So that's kind of, those things are going to be correlated, I think.
Yeah, 100%. I don't mean to claim that this is completely the stability fee, but all things kind of go hand in hand, and no one like item exists in a vacuum. So one of the interesting things is the stability fee also has an impact on what happens with secondary lending. And so to some extent, you saw an increase from, maybe 2.5 million, like 2 million DAI being supplied on secondary lending platforms to about 14 in that same sort of time span. This is a shorter time span graph, but it's still that May to June period. And then you saw the amount of DAI being borrowed on those platforms as well rise to about 11.5 million from basically nothing, maybe 1 to 2 million. And so to some extent, 10 million plus DAI was roughly refinanced, you could think about. And so that does contribute out of, a 90 million or 85 million supply, that does contribute to some of the drop in the age. But also, and I do want to touch on the fees in a bit. I'll pull that up. But also you do see this interesting pattern of a continual accrual of unpaid fees and some periodic jumps in fees getting paid back. And there appears to be a bit of a periodicity emerging in terms of when fees get paid back, when new CDPs get opened, when old CDPs get closed out, almost on kind of like a monthly cycle, but it's a little premature for me to be sort of guessing trends like that. So yeah, just kind of touch on that is you do see almost every month, like clockwork, kind of this dip in the percentage of draws that are happening on new CDPs versus old. So it's almost like a cycle, but I don't want to get too cute here. So what's interesting is during that same time frame of this run up, we saw far fewer draws happening on new CDPs versus old. So more of the debt that was being pulled out of Maker was being pulled out of pre-existing CDPs, and presumably because the overall outstanding loan amount was continually increasing during that time, that more of those new loans were coming from secondary lending platforms.
Vishesh, I have a quick question about the graph right above this one. Yeah, no, lower. One more down. Yeah, so new draws versus existing CDPs, are you counting that as the first draw on a new CDP and then the second draw after that falls into the red category of existing CDPs? Or what's the specifics there?
So it's actually not. It's draws on CDPs that were opened within a time frame. I think it's within 7 days or so.
All right, that makes more sense. Okay.
Yeah. So collateralization has continually been rising over time. I think as the ETH price has continually been rising over time, people have perceived kind of this greater height to fall from, and so they've kept a little bit more collateral in the system. What's interesting to note is in the past 24, 48 hours, a ton of collateral has been freed from the system. So this is not even with like liquidations and such, but also people have pulled out some collateral. And that tends to happen when the ETH price goes up because, presumably as the stability fee was reduced 17, 16, around here, this 450-ish level was something that people were presumably comfortable with. As ETH price continued to rise, that number just ran up from, simple math. But then as people saw the ETH price start to rise up, they started to remove some collateral from the system. Now, I'm guessing with the drop in ETH price, you'll see the opposite trend, where people will sort of counter the drops and the liquidations, and you'll probably see this go back up. But I don't want to call my shot too early on that. I'm going to pause for questions, or if I ran over time, I wasn't checking the clock. But I do want to pull up the fees if I can. So just give me a moment. If anybody has any questions, I guess that would be a good time, or if Rich wants to cut me off.
Did you see anything interesting with secondary lending protocols in the last week?
I did. So the secondary lending platforms, as I showed, the total borrow and supply volumes both have run up since they've been running up for the past week or so. The borrow has outpaced supply a little bit, and so those rates have come up a little bit. Actually, I can show that graph. So that was here. So what you've seen is kind of consistently DYDX has had a higher rate than compound, both for borrow. For supply, it's generally been lower. So that's an interesting little tidbit. The supply rates do tend to flip-flop a little bit more than the borrow rates, but the sort of weighted average of the amount that is being lent on those platforms and what the rates are has run up a little bit in the past week to almost touching the stability fee. And then at times DYDX has run over it. So that is, I think, a curious tidbit with kind of this sort of rise in volume that I was talking about. But what's interesting is the supply volume running up on those platforms, because when you see a fair amount more debt being drawn out of MakerDAO, and you see a fair amount of DAI for ETH trading, some people, I guess, are either paying back those loans or writing them off, booking the profits, ignoring the fees, and then perhaps that DAI that's getting purchased by people is being lent out on those platforms. Now, the implication for that on stability fees is curious, because if there exists this pool of loans that people have kind of walked away from, or CDPs they don't care about, and those are accruing fees that might never get realized, those would skew the numbers. But it's really hard to filter those out.
All right, we're at the half-hour
you,
mark, so let's switch over to Cyrus. He's promised some intriguing slide work for the day, so I'm anxious to get my eyes on that. Cyrus, you want to take it away?
Sure.
I'm going to reuse that phrase slide work constantly over the course of these next few meetings, so I hope you're prepared for that. Here it is. Right on.
Vishesh, that was like a really cool presentation. That was a lot of really cool numbers. You presented it well.
Thanks.
Okay, we good? You guys can see the screen, right?
Yes.
Okay, today we're going to talk a little bit more about calculating stability fees and expected losses. just as a reminder where we are in the overall process, we're obviously doing the quant modeling. I think in the next couple of weeks, either next week or the week after, we'll circle back to the collateral onboarding process and then resume with the quant stuff. And this is kind of the mini outline for the quantitative stuff. So today we'll talk about credit risk. Next few weeks, we'll talk a little bit about liquidation ratio, which is really just a continuation of stability fee discussions. In general, for this week and going forward, it's a bit difficult at times for me to kind of figure out what the right level of detail is for these presentations. So if anything is too detailed, please ask for clarification, or if it's not detailed enough, please, I encourage you guys to jump in with questions as well. Okay, so quick recap from last week. We calculated our risk rating from our due diligence report. We still haven't seen what to do with that yet. We talked a little bit about how the risk premium as attached to a CDP is some function of its loss distribution, and expected loss being the average or mean of that loss distribution. That expected loss is itself a function of the probability of default of a CDP, the severity of the loss given default, and the amount of actual debt attached to a CDP. And in turn, those metrics clearly have something to do with the underlying asset price and its behavior, as well as user-induced behavior, such as adding or removing collateral or adding and removing DAI. And what we are going to look at today is how to essentially think about the collateral asset, how to think about the behavior, and then how to package everything up together into calculating the stability fee. What is this poll here? Rich, are you doing quick polls?
I'm gathering signals while you're doing your slide work.
Okay.
It's unrelated.
Okay, so in general, credit risk is a pretty hard problem, mainly due to the randomness of these underlying assets, right? Anybody who claims to know what ETH is going to do, come talk to me on the side. But nonetheless, there's a lot of different approaches and ideas and models in how to gain some understanding of the underlying asset. Probably too many to cover today, or certainly in 30 minutes. But intuitively, one simple way of trying to understand an asset is by just looking at its history, right? How has a certain asset behaved in the past? I mean, as we all know, past behavior does not indicate future behavior, but it's certainly a good starting point. And in practice, due to just the difficulties, it's often just used as a substitute, and then you can try to analyze how good it behaves over time. Simple example, company in the energy sector wants to borrow money, right? They want to issue some debt. One way to calculate the probability of default for such a company is to just look at all companies in that sector over the last 50 years, right? Say you have like 1,000 companies in the energy sector and 20 of them defaulted. Well, maybe 2% is a fairly good starting point for what you expect the company that you're looking at is likely to default on its debt. And then from a similar analysis, you can also calculate its potential losses. You can, of course, improve on this with fundamental analysis, and this kind of dives into credit ratings, where they basically compile all this data, do the due diligence, everything, and package it up into a rating. These ratings from these ratings, you can often derive the metrics that you're looking for. So interesting question is, does this work with CDPs? Can we just look at CDPs over the past year and a half, right? There's been some thousands of CDPs and some hundreds of liquidations, and just take a ratio and say, roughly 5% of CDPs are likely to default. The answer is probably not, simply because we just don't have enough data that spans a wide enough range of the underlying asset's behavior, Ether. So in the first example, I mean, we're talking about decades of data versus just a year and a half. And it's probably, I mean, we can certainly use a starting point, but probably in and of itself, not sufficient. Okay, so as I've alluded to many times before, probably going to explore a variety of models. My preference is to start kind of with an academic model, because it, in my opinion, helps build up a lot of the intuition behind the stuff. Talk a little bit about why it's not so great, see what we can save, improve it, iterate it, and just kind of keep doing this over and over again. So in some ways, today's presentation is not, does not reflect the realities, but it might. So let's see. Let's just dive right into it. Okay, so first step, let's define some variables. The collateral asset price, we'll just call it A. The T subscript is, of course, the time. So basically the price of ETH over time. And CDP owners lock up a certain amount of collateral value, which is the price of ETH times the quantity of ETH that they lock up. We'll call that collateral value V. They draw K debt. They pay a stability fee S and maintain a collateralization ratio of V over K, which we'll call X. We'll also kind of define the whole space of user behavior just by F for now. We're probably not going to talk too much about user behavior today because I don't think we'll have time. But essentially, we have to account for the fact that users, as I mentioned, can add or subtract collateral or pay down or draw more DAI. This is important because CDPs are not static. So if you have a CDP that has a liquidation price of 200, I think, as we all know, as we approach that 200 price point, users will tend to take action that will kind of push their liquidation price lower. They'll either pay back debt or they'll add collateral. And this is just important for modeling. Essentially, the probability of the CDP being liquidated changes over time. Collateral value V is a function of the asset price and the behavior. Just talked about this. The debt is a function of the stability fee, time, and user behavior. So stability fee and time, what I mean by that is kind of the accrued stability fees over time. And the user behavior is whether they are drawing or wiping DAI. In addition to standard user behavior of trying to avoid liquidations, there are some technical edge cases as well. In particular, the Oracle security module, which has a 1 hour price feed delay. So essentially, if the collateral asset just completely plummets, users are incentivized to draw as much DAI as possible, since the collateral is worthless anyways. So we need to be cognizant of this as well. So the time horizon of CDPs, we all know they're open-ended, right? But it's helpful to just kind of assume a 1 year forward-looking period. Somewhat arbitrary, but also fairly standard, and it doesn't really change the analysis too much. And we know that CDPs default when they hit the liquidation ratio L, and this notation here at the end is basically saying the first instance at which the price, or the first instance at which the collateralization ratio crosses the liquidation ratio is when default occurs. We'll call it T1, just kind of arbitrary. Any questions so far? Okay, cool. Okay, a few more. The CDP is liquidated with probability Q, and so this is the probability that that T1 threshold is breached before our 1 year time horizon. So this is definitely something critical that we're interested in. And we know that this probability depends on the evolution of the collateralization ratio, which in turn depends on the value of the collateral and the amount of DAI debt, which in turn depends on this stuff we talked about before, asset price and user behavior. At liquidation, fraction of the debt that is recovered from the collateral sale is W, somewhat arbitrary variables. This represents the loss given default, or 1 minus the loss given default. And as we all know, this represents the slippage adjustment for when you liquidate the collateral. The less slippage there is, the higher amount of the debt that you recover. And then of course we have this amount offset by the liquidation penalty as well, or I should say added back in. R is the risk-free rate from traditional world, plays a role. And our credit spread, which is essentially what we're solving for, is defined by S minus R. And we'll ignore DSR adjustments for now. And the expected loss of a single CDP, which is what ultimately we're trying to solve for here, is the product of these three variables. Are we all good? Any questions so far on kind of any of these pre-model specifications? Cool. Okay. So we already know we want to solve for probabilities, losses, and exposure amounts. And we need to develop some intuition around the asset price and user behavior. Standard approach to modeling an asset price is to apply what's known as a stochastic process, which we'll talk about in a second. And just helps us understand the asset in a variety of ways. It's not perfect, but it's fairly standard, and has quite a history behind it. And then to model to model user behavior, we can analyze historical CDP stats and go from there. Vishesh and Alex have done a lot of great work in this area, and I hope and I think we'll be able to explore that in a little bit later as well. And in some instances, you can just look at user behavior directly and maybe even bypass collateral assets. Right. So the way I like to think about it is you can look at the CDP's loans by themselves, or you can try to pick the CDP apart and look a little bit like deeper at its underlying assets. I think there are advantages and disadvantages to both, and in some cases we can even do a hybrid. To kind of to clarify that a bit, so if you think about that corporate debt example I used a few slides ago, it's not always easy or even possible to actually model the underlying assets that is behind debt. Sometimes you can only just look at it from the debt level and try to model how the debt behaves over time or historically. In some cases, such as our CDPs with ETH, you can actually model the underlying asset, which I think gives us an advantage. But there could very easily come a time where the collateral that is put into CDPs is just a representation, right? It's not something that can be modeled directly or easily. So it's kind of interesting to have different approaches in mind. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about that stochastic model for the ETH price that I was talking about. And I'm going to impose a bunch of assumptions right now and then relax them slowly because it's a lot to do it all at once. So I'm going to ignore user behavior for now. The ability for users to add or remove collateral at will at any time and to add or subtract DAI at any time makes things really complicated. Honestly causes a lot of headache, just adds a lot of complexity, which I mean is what makes MakerDAO such an awesome protocol, right? It's extremely flexible, but it becomes a little bit difficult to analyze. I'm going to assume no slippage for the collateral amount. So essentially, as soon as liquidation is triggered, you can recover everything. Constant risk-free rate, constant volatility. And volatility here is a historical volatility based off of the trading history. Returns are normally distributed. I'll get into what that is for next slide. No early liquidations, which seems like a silly assumption. And asset price cannot gap up or down. And okay, so essentially the reason why I've imposed all these seemingly random assumptions is if you go through all this, then you can create a nice little model called the Merton model, which is almost a 50-year-old model by now. And this was actually part of the pioneering stages of modern options pricing theory. Basically, if you assume that a collateral asset behaves a certain way, you can do interesting stuff with it. So this equation up here at the top is known as a stochastic differential equation. And essentially what it's saying is that an asset price can be reduced to, in every small time increment, it will move a little bit in accordance with its historical mean, plus some random component that is scaled by the volatility. And that random component is quite literally just almost think of it like as an RNG. And essentially you can simulate thousands of different price paths for collateral asset where each price path is a potential likely simulation for the evolution of this asset price. So you can say ETH goes, you can say Ether will tend to go up over time according to some expected return or some mean. But then, of course, there's this volatility component, which will cause it to veer in all sorts of ways. And so what we can do is we can calculate these sample paths, and then let's say we compute thousands of them. And then we can merely just calculate the number of them which end up below our liquidation threshold.
So Cyrus, is this where, are these the returns that you were making assumptions about their distribution? This is not, is this the return of the underlying asset?
Yes. You mean these?
Yeah, so returns are normally distributed. So this would mean the logs of the returns are normally distributed. So the returns themselves would be log normally distributed, right?
Yeah. The log, yeah, exactly.
Got it.
Okay, so a few things we can glean from this kind of model. One is, as I mentioned, we can calculate the frequency of the paths which end up below our threshold, which will help us determine the probability of distribution. And actually, at the same time, we can just calculate how much loss each particular path is associated with, and essentially knock out two birds with one stone here. Kind of those two metrics come together. So let's keep going for a bit, and hopefully it becomes more clear. But if not, don't worry about it, because this is all fairly theoretical as well. So first assumption that we can relax is no early liquidations. That's kind of an easy one to get rid of. And here we can kind of see the same style of model, but essentially as soon as the paths breach the threshold, liquidation is triggered. And that's more in line with the model that we're used to. This green one should not have an error to it. But. And let's get rid of this asset price cannot gap up or down as well. And so we've modified our process a little bit by adding a jump variable, which essentially means that the asset price can kind of gap up or down at any random moment. And this y variable here, this dy, is essentially what's known as a Poisson process, which essentially means that a event will occur with a certain frequency, and then the goal is to try to calculate what the frequency of that event occurring is, and with what size. And so one interesting question is how to actually calculate the frequency of these big jumps up or down. This is something we've been doing a little bit of research on, essentially pouring through historical data for the markets and trying to say, okay, how many times has ETH had a sudden crash? What was the magnitude of the moves, and so forth? And then going from there. So that's some interesting research we've been doing on the side. Happy to chat about on the chat. Interestingly enough, we haven't actually used our risk rating for anything yet. And essentially, even without it, with just the trading data, we could have actually calculated everything up to the stability fee. But that's not necessarily very reflective of reality. And again, the easiest example for that would be the kind of the ETH versus some fiat-backed stablecoin, which everybody knows has a chance of having a sudden plummet, right? So if we wanted to incorporate some likelihood of an asset collapsing, we wouldn't be able to glean that from the historical data. And this is where we would incorporate our qualitative information for a collateral asset. So we can essentially use that to say we believe that the intensity or the frequency with which these jumps are likely to happen is higher or lower based on the risk characteristics of the organization behind it. Okay, so from the rest of this list, not going to be able to cover everything today. So this first one, behavior, super important, which we will get to hopefully next call. Slippage as well when it comes to calculating the liquidation ratio and evaluating the liquidity of the markets as well. This third one is also fairly easy to relax. Essentially requires using its own interest rate stochastic model. And these last two are a little bit contentious. So we'll talk about that another time as well. So the next steps after this, what we've done so far is single asset for a single CDP. And we want to evolve this to single asset with multiple CDPs. So right now we have thousands of CDPs, each with their own debt, their own collateral, their own liquidation price. And we can't do a full simulation one by one per CDP. It's just not feasible. So what we would have to do is take distribution of CDPs and model them as a whole. And that's been a lot of the work that we've been doing. And then furthermore, we don't want to ideally have just one liquidation ratio bucket, but you might want to have CDPs with a 150% liquidation ratio that have a certain stability fee, but another set of CDPs that have a 200% liquidation ratio that might have a lower stability fee because they've committed to keeping a higher collateral reserve. So these are all things we can do with the model that I've just described. Of course, this would require modeling the actual collateralization ratio as opposed to the asset, which is just a few small tweaks. Still a lot of research to do in terms of kind of sharpening our corners, but I think we're getting there for sure. And so essentially, everything we've done so far is to calculate that expected loss, which how much do you expect to lose on a particular CDP or group of CDPs, right? And big question is how to get from this to the actual stability fee calculation. So the easiest way to think about that is to just, let's first take a quick minor step back and let's look at a hypothetical risk-free CDP. So imagine a CDP that takes out 100 DAI debt, stability fee of 5%, right? It'll pay back 105 in a year. And let's assume that stability fee payback is completely independent of the collateral asset price. No matter what, if ETH goes to 0, you're still getting back 105 DAI. Well, if that's the case, then that CDP would not have a stability fee larger than the risk-free rate, because there's no risk to it, right? And of course, I know it's the turn of the hour, Rich. I'll be done in a couple slides. Now, of course, stability fees do depend on the underlying asset. And we know that below a certain price, which is 100% collateralization ratio, there are losses that start to accrue. Thinking of this from the perspective of the payoff structure of the CDP. And so this slide didn't come out good. So essentially what I'm trying to get here is that, so we have this risk-free CDP, and we have a CDP here that looks more like our actual CDPs. And that difference here is this chart here in the middle, which, if anyone has picked up on the clues, this whole presentation is very reminiscent of standard options theory. And essentially, the payoff structure for a CDP resembles behaviorally an implicit put option on the underlying assets. There's no actual put option here, but it's a very helpful heuristic to help us model the expected loss. The expected loss is the price of a implicit put option on ETH, where the strike price is equal to the amount of DAI debt that's been borrowed. So another way to explain this is, right now as a CDP owner, you may, let's say you were the counterparty to the CDP owner. You have that downside risk where if the collateral value drops below the amount, then you would start to accrue losses. And those losses, which is what we've been trying to calculate so far, resembles that of a put option. And so, just a hypothetical example, collateralize 1 ETH, borrow 200 DAI, and assume that your expected loss, or that the price of the put option with a strike of 200 is $10, then what you are trying to do is find the yield of this risky CDP, which is a combination of the risk-free and that implicit put, and that is actually how you get your stability fee. Any questions? Okay, last slide. Was this all worth it? Maybe. Definitely a good amount of complexity here, and a good amount of assumptions. In particular, the log normal distribution of the asset price, which is what underpins the stochastic model, underprices the tails, and that's how you end up with outsized moves that you don't expect. It's not it's potentially not great for assets that don't have a lot of historical data. And in many ways, looking at empirical models would be better in some regards, because I think it could have a better tail distribution. But as I've mentioned, it doesn't necessarily factor in the right qualitative risk characteristics. So I think some ideal blend could be combining the empirical with some sensible qualitative risk adjustment. And then interestingly enough, there's also a thing called expert models where you can just defer to somebody who claims to know what they're talking about. But we won't be doing that one unless you guys want Rich to just determine all the risk parameters by himself. That's it.
All right, thank you, Cyrus. Younessi, there's a lot to digest here. If people have questions, they want to absorb some of this stuff, surface it in the chat at the side. I'm going to use this as a slight segue to talk about signaling in debate and these deeper discussions, because this is a path that MakerDAO is going to be heading down more and more as the world and crypto gets more complicated, particularly in these governance calls, and particularly as we begin to shift focus more towards risk. Right now, the deep discussion venue that we have, unfortunately, is Reddit. And Reddit is not, this may come as a surprise to people, but it's not designed for deep and thoughtful discussion. So what we're going to do, what we have done, is we're going to release very soon a forum for the MakerDAO ecosystem. And in that forum, we have numerous top-level categories. Those top-level categories will be /r community, governance, and risk, and X, Y, and Z as well. And this is going to be where we begin to really get serious about debates, long-tail debates. So we'll be able to take some of the really amazing manifestos that have been posted into Reddit and were subsequently ignored because there was just too much for people with the Reddit attention span to absorb, myself included, transitioning those into an official forum, sort of along the lines of ETH Research, where we have a proposal, a manifesto, a slide deck, algorithms from Cyrus's team, and we can spend days, weeks, and potentially months debating the finer points of those things. It's looking for, the target for that launch is July 1st, the week, actually, let's call it the first week of July. It's over optimistic, but that's coming. And so I wanted to put that out there, that if you don't have a question right now, you haven't missed the boat. We recognize the need that for a long-term, very detailed debating mechanism with some light reputation management and polling built in. And that's been built. It's being, last week's are being applied, and it'll be released to the community first week of July. Sorry, so did you have anything else that you wanted to leave us with, or can we move to the weekly narrative now? I know that you'd sort of threatened to drop a bomb on us, and I'm trying to give you an out of whether you still want to do that.
I did what now?
You did what now? Hey, Cyrus, do you want to talk about the debt ceiling? How's that?
Sure.
Right. So yeah, let's lay the groundwork for it and see if we can start a debate. But I also want to make sure that we give Matthew enough time to have his discussion. So let's be cognizant of the time. It's 10 after the hour.
So who's going to go first?
You're going to drop bombs on us, and then we're going to talk.
Yeah, I was just, I guess, noticing that the debt ceiling was starting to creep up a little bit. I thought it'd be interesting to discuss. As a quick reminder or refresher, there's obviously some risks involved with not increasing the debt ceiling.
All right, so let's frame this thing. So I'm going to try and put some energy into this convo right now.
Yeah.
So here's the idea that we
I'm
have.
exhausted from the presentation, man.
Yeah, the slide work takes a lot out of you, I can tell. So here's the idea that we've constantly been debating the fact that we have a limited number of levers in this ecosystem. The lever that's been exposed right now is the stability fee. There was a lot of back and forth, a lot of very considered discussions about whether we should be playing with more levers than that. I think that we've seen that the measured discussion was correct. We fixed things as a community with the stability fee. But the market conditions have changed. Inventory levels presumably have recovered to healthy levels. Secondary lending platforms have arisen to take some of the pressure off of us. We are no longer in an extended bear market. Well, maybe it just started in the last hour again, so who knows. But up until today, we weren't in an extended bear market. So maybe it's time to actually start looking at the fact that raising or tweaking the debt ceiling might actually be a valid option at this point, because we're not adding insult to injury. We're not trying to disguise the fact that or overcompensate for supply and demand issues. We actually have a healthy ecosystem that could potentially demand a higher debt ceiling, and that's as far as my understanding goes. So I can jazz up the convo a bit, but I'm not clever enough to know whether it's a good idea or not. And I think that's where the analysts and the community needs to jump in with some suggestions or some ideas or some perspective on whether, is it smart to raise the debt ceiling, or should we leave things the way they are? That's the kind of the question.
Let's hear from let's hear from Matthew and Vishesh on that, because I'm sure they have some good thoughts
Vishesh,
on that
go.
as well.
Tell us what's happening.
All right.
We want to know what would Vishesh do.
I hate that meme. But I mean, obviously, I think the thing to think about is we know we don't want to hit the debt ceiling. I think that's fairly agreed upon. We could debate that if not. But I think the question is, what is the likelihood that we hit the debt ceiling? What is the downside of having the debt ceiling be slightly higher if we're not going to hit it, which I think is relatively low? And in what scenario should we worry about the debt ceiling? And so, I know that's a lot of questions that I'm basically unpacking your question, Rich, into 4 or 5. But I think some of the answers are pretty clear, which is, okay, let's assume we don't want to hit it. Let's assume there's relatively low risk in increasing the debt ceiling if we are not going to hit it. Now, the one caveat is, if the debt ceiling is increased and somebody goes ahead and aggressively votes down the stability fee, that's your risk scenario. So given that both of those things are under the control of this governance process, presumably there's some, higher hive mind intelligence here that realizes don't do both of those things. Because in the scenario that the stability fee is artificially depressed or inflated from external market factors, and those external market factors change, a sudden drop in ETH price, then you might be worried about people deciding to lever up, DAI price potentially taking a hit, and us deciding, hey, we need to react and make a change to the stability fee. So that kind of reactionary behavior in response to market forces is riskier when there's a higher debt ceiling, because then you could just 20 million more DAI overnight.
So if we do expose 2 levers, it's going to be even harder for us to figure out which one we should be pulling, and also disincentivizing the community, or making sure that the voters don't pick the easiest short-term win in that model.
Yeah, so you're trading one risk for another, and the risk that you are reducing is the risk that you hit the debt ceiling and you have to work harder to unwind some of the negative effects that get bottled up from doing so. The risk that you are gaining is the risk that the governance process kind of lets a fox into the henhouse, reduces the stability fee, and somehow somebody decides to bully the situation and overnight mints a bunch of DAI, either crashing the die price or creating a whole bunch of other negative effects.
Yeah, you wanna walk this tightrope where you don't have the risk of hitting the debt ceiling too quickly, but you don't leave as much, you don't leave more open room than you really need to. So you want to just kind of keep like a safe distance from the debt ceiling.
And your weighting changes, right?
The what?
The weighting changes. So delays are fun. Go for it, Rich.
All right. Well, I'm just saying that there potentially there's an order of operations here where you make the system healthy with the primary lever, which is the stability fee, and once you've established, or if you have some kind of a monitoring system that can tell you that the inventory levels are healthy due to the stability fees being appropriate and that matching user behavior, secondary lending platforms, whatever, then it's safe to raise and lower the the debt ceiling. But the debt ceiling is not the primary go-to risk parameter to tweak, right? Is that the idea?
So I think there's two caveats. One is to the extent that there is a 14 million float on secondary lending platforms in terms of DAI supply, that reduces the fear that you should have of hitting the debt ceiling. The more excess supply sits on secondary lending platforms, the less worrisome it should be that you're nearing the debt ceiling. Now, as that supply, because that's kind of your buffer range, as that comes down, yeah, you have the chance of grinding bone against bone and getting some pain out of that. But I don't think we're quite there. I do think it's definitely worth starting to raise that conversation and starting to be aware that that may be something we want to do soon, because even at the current stability fees, the supply has been increasing. Now, this supply on those secondary lending platforms has also been increasing. So it's it may be a little bit misleading to just look at the DAI supply. But that being said, I think it's a good conversation. I think it's worth raising. It's something we should think about soon. And on the flip side, what I'm saying is if you do decide to increase the debt ceiling, then you got to be a hell of a lot more careful about decreasing the stability fee. Because even if even if it's all quiet for like a week or two or a month even, and nobody prints a massive amount of DAI, if the stability fee is lowered, it just increases your susceptibility to that kind of event occurring. And so that's what I just mean is increase your weight on how cautious you are about decreasing the stability fee if you increase the debt ceiling.
You need to leave enough of a gap in there so that one rogue actor can't decide to mint a bunch of DAI and crash the price. You want to leave enough. You don't want to have so much of a buffer where we make this debt ceiling 500 million and the current outstanding DAI is 80. And if you lower the stability fee, you're just taking unnecessary risk.
Right. And so the stability fee I actually look at as kind of like a speed adjustment. So when the stability fee is higher, the supply moves slower. And when the stability fee is lower, in terms of in response to demand, and when the stability fee is lower, it moves faster. Now, it also, not just demand, but also moves faster and slower in response to ETH price changes. So the one caveat I would say is it doesn't necessarily have to be this like malicious rogue actor or whatever. It could just be ETH, and ETH could be our rogue actor and make significant price changes, drop to 260, whatever, I don't care, and cause a bunch of different people to act on behalf of market forces, which is basically the same effect as like a rogue actor.
Is it possible to write into the code that if DAI ever touches the debt ceiling, then there's like an automatic plus 5% stability fee implemented, which would allow you to lower the buffer between the outstanding DAI and the debt ceiling? While, yeah, you would let it get closer a little bit, right?
Or wouldn't it depend on like the state of the peg? That's also like something to consider.
Yeah, but I mean, you're talking about existing code and single collateral DAI that we're not going to change, and we're about to launch multi-collateral DAI. No, I get it, but the point in general, and I'm about to do a little presentation of this, is that in single collateral DAI, the fundamental lever to control the supply and demand was the stability fee, right? In multi-collateral DAI, to some extent that's going to shift away, and it should shift away. So changing the underlying risk premium for a specific collateral shouldn't be the method to control supply and demand.
Yeah, and I'll echo kind of, probably there's some Redditors who are groaning right now. The changing the stability fee doesn't necessarily solve your problem, right? So even if you hit the debt ceiling, you jack up the stability fee, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to solve the underlying friction that you run into from hitting the debt ceiling. So like, let's say the stability fee was, 14, 13%. You hit that debt ceiling because somebody, minted a bunch of DAI. People can continue to source DAI theoretically from secondary lending platforms to the extent that that supply exists. But if you increase the stability fee, you may also reduce the supply that exists on those secondary lending platforms, and you may not necessarily reduce the DAI supply. It sort of depends on what the rates are. And so it could solve the problem. It doesn't necessarily solve the problem. And this is where I think some people have voiced some frustration that the stability fee is a bit of a blunt instrument. Totally true. The stability fee works well when the relative rates on other platforms are sort of, 2 to 3% lower, let's say, or there's a decent kind of buffer range. If they started to run up to be equal to the stability fee for some reason, or even higher, then increasing the stability fee might not solve your problem at all. And so it's a really complex kind of problem. And so I would caution away from thinking that if you hit the debt ceiling, okay, just jack up the stability fee and that'll fix everything.
Yeah, and the danger, or the scary part right now, is all the thinking we've constructed thus far under single collateral DAI and how we use the stability fee, is somewhat changing, right? I mean, when you go into this multi-collateral stuff that we're rotating into, and this is kind of like a little segue to, as this whole learning process goes on, it's painfully humbling. And I want to say thank you very much to Vishesh, Cyrus, Alex, and other guys in the Maker chat and Reddit for some of this stuff. From the conversation we had last week, kind of took some of the commentary that folks had and kind of digested what were my failings, what were the pieces that I were basically missing on that. And, kind of, let me just share this, kind of reconstructed back to what I thought was, where we started, which is in single collateral DAI, where we only have Ethereum. And we know our liquidation, we know our collateralization, we know our debt ceiling, it's changeable, and the risk premium is what's changing dozens and dozens of times, or will be or has been. And that's what we're using as our fundamental quote unquote collateral package. And as it kind of, here's my fourth grader drawing again, as that relates, where you've got a risk premium, and that interest rate is what we're using to balance back and forth, and how we're trying to swing back and forth to try and stabilize the price. It's not the world's best graphic, but I hope the message kind of comes across. But the idea behind it, when we switch over to a multi-collateral area where we're going to have, insert your name of collateral, the liquidation ratio will be static for that package, so will the collateralization ratio, and so will the debt ceiling for the most part. But the risk premium for it, it's going to get set by a risk team member. It'll be modified maybe weekly, but it's conditions based on the risk of the collateral package as a whole, not anything to do, it shouldn't have anything to do with the price as it relates to the price of DAI. It should only be risk driven, and risk driven to the point where this collateral package as an aggregate, as compared to the whole, should be viewed in effect as being riskless. In effect, an insurance wrapper around a collateral of whatever that type is. If it's Ether with X liquidation ratio and Y collateralization ratio, those are going to be different. And we set the risk premiums accordingly, but we really shouldn't have to change them that frequently. Conditions on the ground that drive the risk. So in Cyrus's comment about putting an energy company and putting their debt as a function of collateral, conditions on the ground. If oil prices go to $5 a barrel, okay, there's a high chance that company might default. The risk premium should get adjusted accordingly. But that still doesn't change anything to do with, it shouldn't have anything to do with the price of DAI yet. It's purely de-risking a collateral package to the point where it's riskless. So the corollary to this is kind of in an MCD world where we're in effect using the DSR and weighting it against the riskless offset of this litany of riskless collateral packages. Some of them mint die, some of them burn die, and the DSR is what's used to mop up the riskless die that was minted off of them, which is kind of a little bit of a toe into what we discussed last week about if die that's being minted isn't riskless, then you start injecting you inject risk into the system because you can't really tell because the DSR is mopping up, using a riskless tool to mop up die that was coming from a risky source. To keep them in balance, the risk premium has to be set by risk team people that know that. This will kind of tee into the end of this conversation of like, what are we actually going to be voting on in 6 months, in a year, in 3 years? And how will we be able to handle the quantity of risk premium voting? And will we even be voting on that, or will we just be voting on the recommendations from a risk team? So it's because of each collateral package, when they're dialed in or tuned, and they are basically riskless, using the DSR is warranted because the riskless natures offset each other. So, and for all the electrical engineers out there, or engineers, this is my poor man starting circuit concept, where at the end of the day, you have your DSR, which in effect absorbs whatever the collateral that comes out, but your real objective is such that this piece over here stays with whatever energy is out there, but there's no real current moving back and forth. There's no die or electrons that are moving. You want it to be stable. So that goes really to the question for the Maker Foundation is and the community as a whole is, how will we handle voting on risk premiums at 1, 2, 40, or will we not vote on them at all and outsource it to a risk team that provides a recommendation? Or will we be taking multiple risk teams and taking some type of median or average or weighted average based on some system, I don't know, and saying, 5 people, like almost like a shard of the decision making, and then taking some type of computed version saying that here are the 400 collaterals we've got hanging out there. Here are the recommended slight modifications this week, and then either vote for it or you veto it, or it's an outstanding question. I don't know the answer to that one.
So are these rhetoricals, or are these things you're asking right now? Because
I mean, we don't need to know it today. It's more of a question, legitimately, in 6 months, how can we, the biggest concern that I think all of us should have is those risk premiums that are going to be assigned to a given collateral package that Cyrus and team will compute and spend valuable time figuring out what it should be. How do we maintain them? And
yeah, and well, let me start answering some of these theoreticals, or some of these hypotheticals with some theoreticals. So here, the idea is that we don't know, but it's not like we're unprepared. We've been discussing precisely that basically internally for the last 8 to 12 months, because there's no surprise that complexity is how to measure. This governance process that we've been experimenting with for the last 41 weeks is to determine exactly what that picture looks like, and to get the community educated and engaged enough to help us to discover the answer to those questions. So that's a bunch of euphemisms and unknowns, I understand, but here's the idea, is that we need the community to tell us what their appetite is for engagement. We need to figure out exactly how involved people are. We need to figure out where these discussions happen, and then we need to figure out whether we need to optimize or whether we don't. And all of those things we can and have come up with elaborate plans to anticipate and or guess about how that might turn out, and to talk about how we'd like to have that turn out, but it's ultimately not up to us. So the idea is that, and I touched on this briefly earlier, that we have a forum coming. That forum is going to be the place where we figure out the answers to these questions. And so we'll take things like your most recent weekly narrative, Matthew, which I loved, and we'll give it a pride of place in the forum. So in the governance forum, we will have, this is the questions about how we address packages or tranches of risk parameters, and how often do we bite these things off? What's a reasonable amount of work that we can expect from the community versus the friction involved with constant maintenance through the voting portal. There's all kinds of things we need to figure out. So the answer is, we've anticipated this stuff. We have a lot of ideas. I think the community also has a lot of ideas. And the next step is to start formalizing them and figuring out which ones work and starting to put those into place. You've raised some really interesting points that we've been debating for a long time now. So I realize that was a bit of a non-answer. So that you raised a lot of great questions. We agree that those are great questions. We have some ideas, but the solution to finding the answers to those great ideas is we need to improve our signaling methods. We need to release the next version of the portal, which allows us to do multiple polls at once instead of being completely dominated by a weekly stability fee poll. And we need to have long, deep discussions in a semi-formalized manner, and that's where the forum comes in. Did that address any of your concerns, Matthew?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I think the greatest concern of the entire project is how to maintain, call it tranches, packages, whatever the mnemonic will be, that those risk premiums are priced consistent with the risks compared to the system, and that they maintain the exponential nature of the risk that they actually have. If we start having too much apathy towards that and just a little bit of ignoring the conditions on the ground, and I mean, I'm not picking a crypto token. I mean, the price of oil, the price of real estate, you name it. We start getting lax on that, and the whole project can implode on itself. And that's what.
Yeah, we agree. And this is something that I mentioned that we've been having these discussions. So we talk about governance all the time inside MakerDAO, and then we get to talk about it publicly for an hour on Thursdays. But one of the things that, one of the most often requested, floated, or suggested future plans for governance is that the reality of the situation is that not everybody in our ecosystem is either willing, able, or has the time to be deeply engaged and weigh all the evidence. So people are keen for delegates, or some kind of a delegation system, or some kind of mechanism where we identify people that are trusted enough to make some of these high-level decisions. We already have a model for that. That model is the risk teams. They get together, they collect the data, they create the models, they present their frameworks, and then the community ratifies those. And potentially, as that ecosystem or as that model expands, gets more refined, then we can start applying that to other things. So maybe there's a utility token tranche administration team or something. There's all kinds of options available to us, but I'm very reluctant to have the foundation, sort of airdrop that onto the ecosystem. We want the community to tell us what they want to do and how they want to self-organize.
So it sounds like to scale governance. Sorry, Rich. So it sounds like to scale governance, in the end, maker holders are going to have to rely on expert models where you defer to the risk teams, right? That's a little bit what Cyrus was talking about in his last slide.
Yeah, that's basically, well, I shouldn't say basically, that is literally what the whole system is designed to do. So if you go back and I recommend that people do this, is read the foundation principle, or the governance risk framework that Stephen published for us. Or you can just skip to the third one, but that's what it's all about. We do scientific governance and risk. This entire framework is designed for that first iteration of gradual decentralization, is that we have risk teams who are deep into the science and the history of this world. They present models and ideas and data sets, and then the neophytes and the amateurs like me are in a position to read all that stuff and figure out whether we have confidence in those systems, and then we vote them in or we vote them out. That same model applies to basically everything that governance is going to be doing in the future, but it's an evolutionary process. And I think that we've cautioned, I hope that we've been good about this message, is that I can't really iterate strongly enough how interested, how focused MakerDAO is, the Maker Foundation is on decentralization. That's our core principle. In order to do that responsibly and effectively, we need to do that in steps while we understand how the process works. And the first step in that was the interim risk teams and the decentralized risk teams, which are coming on board soon. We're going to iterate and evolve that process and then keep on identifying skilled groups of stakeholders and figuring out whether we need to split off to different groups or have different venues for a deeper discussion, or we need to identify some other class of actors in the system which we want to empower to start surfacing signals for us as well. But the ecosystem, or the governance ecosystem that we have right now, is the bootstrapping phase. It's going to get significantly more complex in the coming months, I guarantee. But that complexity will be driven by the community, and we need to have people in this call and in the forums to tell us what that's going to look like. Having said that, I need to jump out because big things are afoot in the MakerDAO ecosystem. If you want to know what those big things are, I suggest you go to blog.makerdao.com and you will figure out what is up. But I do need to bounce and deal with some of the resultant buzz. I'm going to, Cyrus, make you a host if you want to continue.
Sure.
And then just make sure you stop the recording before you shut down the call. Because the last time I discovered that there was 3.5 hours of black screen, I had to edit out. I don't want to do it again. All right, thanks everybody for joining. Great discussions again as usual. We'll be posting summaries and recaps and videos and audio to Twitter, the subreddits, and the discussion thread. Please continue the debate there. All right, and that is it. Talk to everybody later.
Anyone have anything they want to talk about?
Yeah, so I have a quick question.
Sure.
Once you start looking at the fundamentals of an asset, doesn't that get rid of the assumption of the normal distribution of the returns?
I mean, looking at the fundamentals of an asset doesn't necessarily have much to do with what its returns look like. I mean, yeah, I mean, no asset has normal returns, right? It's just a completely made up assumption. It's a made up assumption to help the models work, but that's it really. That didn't, okay, let me, can you ask your question a different way?
Well, I mean, if you're just looking at equities, for example, I mean, their returns for the past 10 years haven't been normally distributed.
Right.
So why would you, so once you start looking at the fundamentals, let's say, interest rates are low and there's QE, so then part of the fundamentals, and you say, well, I don't think the returns would be normally distributed, so why would I assume that for my models?
Because in some ways it's the best we can do, right? I mean, all derivatives are priced with a certain set of assumptions, which in practice are extremely difficult to unwind. To relax that assumption would imply that you have some better distribution of what the asset returns look like.
I also think, like, if we're thinking about what are the inputs to modeling a potential price path for an asset, it's one thing to be able to say, I know what the fundamentals are, and so I can tell you how this asset is going to do over a 1 year, 2 year, whatever period. That if you can do that, you don't need to look at any kind of simulation of a normal price path or log normal price path. Now, it's not right, it's not going to be perfect to be able to say, hey, I've got this estimation of a log normal price path, and I'm going to assume that that's the case, right? We're not doing that either. What you're saying is, under various potential assumptions that could produce various log normal price paths, this is what the expected losses would be. And if you're modeling all of the reasonable potential outcomes, and you're taking sort of an average of what all the potential loss values would be under different circumstances, what you're really saying is, given a historical asset volatility, given certain assumptions about the probability of a price crash, et cetera, what am I going to expect in terms of my losses at the end of the day across all the different potential outcomes? And then the way you're arriving at those outcomes is by saying, within each of those iterations in that simulation, you've produced a log normal price path, because there's really no better intermediate alternative. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, well, I have to jump off myself, so I'm going to stop the recording, and then if anybody wants to take over as host, not.